All right, hello everyone. We are still in Unit 6 and we are talking about global and international economics. Our standard right down here is an interesting one. It's one that I enjoy covering. We are talking about the differences between developing and developed regions or nations around the world. In particular, we are going to look at the characteristics of developing nations and contrast them with the developed nations. And we are going to examine why poorly defined property rights have been a problem in developing countries. Now, if you recall way back from Unit 1 at the beginning of the semester, one of the characteristics of the American economy was strong property rights. And I'll talk about that here in a moment. Okay, so this slide looks like there's a lot on it, but it's not that bad. So what is a developed nation? It's the definition is a little more simple than you may think. A developed nation is a nation with a relatively high standard of living and economies that are based more on industry than on agriculture. That is their GDP, if you will. The majority of their GDP comes from industry. That is building and selling things, not farming from the land. Examples are USA, Germany, Canada, New Zealand, England. Most North American and European countries are considered developed nations. Now contrast that with a developing nation. These are nations with little industrial development. Think about the Industrial Revolution. There are still nations out there that really haven't had that revolution yet. And here we had it, over 100 years ago. And there's a relatively low standard of living. And I give you many examples. Most African countries, not all African countries, there are definitely developed nations in African countries such as South Africa and Egypt, and most Middle Eastern countries. Again, I said most, not all. Okay, now there is one phrase I use in those two definitions, that is standard of living. So standard of living is a general term and it refers to a lot of things. It refers to the level of wealth, comfort, material goods, that is your possessions, your assets, healthcare, and other necessities available to the population of different countries. So the higher the standard of living, the overall better as measured by wealth, comfort, possession, so on and so forth, that country is. For example, the standard of living is higher in France than in Uganda based on the above criteria. Now, depending on who you ask, there are about 200 countries in the world with approximately, and I'm estimating here, approximately half of them being classified as developed and the other half being classified as developing. So how can you identify a developing nation? Well, there are 5 characteristics of developing nations. That is a low GDP, an agriculture-based economy, which we just found in the last slide, poor health conditions, a low literacy rate, which is the same thing as an uneducated population, and rapid population growth rate. And as you guys can see, we will be talking about weak property rights as well. So let's knock these out one by one. Okay, a low GDP. We have studied GDP in class. You guys know what that is. So if you compare the GDP or GDP per capita, which is just GDP based on how many number of people there are in the country. For example, it's not fair to compare the GDP of the United States with 350 million people to the GDP of Peru with less than 100 million people. Of course our GDP is going to be higher, all right? So while developing nations may have many natural resources and human resources, they lack equipment, financing, and knowledge, aka capital and human capital, necessary to put these resources to use. In other words, they lack capital, which reduces their GDP. Okay, so if you look at GDP per capita, if they are relatively low, that's an indicator that maybe this is a developing nation. Also, second characteristic is an agriculture-based economy. So much of the population in developing countries exists through what's called subsistence agriculture. This means that each family grows just enough food to take care of feeding themselves and their family. There are no crops available to sell or export to feed an industrial workforce. That is, there is no surplus. You hear the phrase live off the land. These families, they take care of their farm, they feed their family. They do that day in and day out, day in and day out. That's about it. They're not producing enough to sell to grocery stores. So if you want to eat, you must work on a farm. All right, the third characteristic of developing nations is poor health conditions. So many people in developing nations die from stuff over here in America that you can go to your Publix pharmacy and get a pill for, and you're magically cured. We do have a very strong healthcare system. People die from malnourishment. That means not getting the nutrients they need, which mean because they don't have a varied diet. For example, some developing nations in Southeast Asia, their diet consists primarily of rice, and just rice, and more rice, and some more rice. And that obviously leaves a lot of other nutrients that are required to live out of their diet. There is a lack of modern doctors, hospitals, and medicine. What this results in is in low life expectancy. Now, here in America, the life expectancy for adults is in the upper 70s, 76, 77. In certain developing nations around the world, the life expectancy for adults is in the 40s. So we're talking sometimes a 20, sometimes 30-year difference in life expectancy because people die young by, almost, I hate to say it, but routine diseases that modern medicine would have been able to cure, but they simply don't have access to it, and people are dying from it. And the converse, or the inverse, is also true, a high infant mortality rate. Not every baby is born perfectly healthy, but due to modern medicine, we can nourish them back to health. Think about premature babies in other countries. They do not have that. If a baby is born premature or with any minor defect, they often die because they don't have the technology to take care of them. All right, fourth characteristic is a low literacy rate. So a literacy rate is the percentage of people who are able to read and write. Governments in developing nations have few resources to build schools. And also, it's not only that there's not many schools. If there are schools, children have to miss schools to help their family farm. Think about characteristic 2, agriculture-based economy and sustenance farming. This lack of educated workers makes it hard for any other non-agriculture job because they typically require reading and writing. For example, let's say you wanted to go to Bolivia, which is in South America, for the geographically illiterate in here. Bolivia, and you wanted to open up an engineering firm. Well, that may not be very wise unless you bring people with you, because you're not going to find too many people in Bolivia that have the education level to be successful engineers. And finally, we have rapid population growth. So this is best explained through some compare and contrast. The growth of the United States is about 1% per year. In many developing nations, that's closer to 4%. So guys, what that means is, that doesn't look like a lot, but that's 4 times faster. In the poorest countries in the world, their population is growing 4 times faster, which means that all of those issues we just covered, issues 1 through 4, they are compounded 4 times faster because of this. So in a developing nation with a growth rate of 3.6% will double its population in 20 years. It would take the USA over 100 years to double its population. This rapid growth rate really does hinder a lot of these developing nations. Okay, now let's talk about poorly defined property rights. So many economists agree that even out of those 5 things we just covered, the single greatest detriment to developing nations is weak property rights. Conversely, many economists believe the USA prospered so quickly because of very strong property rights. That is, the government says, Mr. Jarrett, you purchase this land, this is your land. You can improve it, you can run to the ground, but your name is tied to this land. If you were born and raised in America or any other developed country, we're ignorant of that. Like, that just makes sense. We wouldn't know it any other way. But contrast it with this. Only 20% of Peru's land is legally owned. That is, the Peruvian government actually assigns ownership to land. Of the remaining 80%, that's crazy, 80%, there is no true ownership. Peasant farmers tend the land as they have done for generations. Think about a traditional economy. Without legal ownership, there is no system in place for exchanging, selling, or developing land to improve its value. So again, guys, out of everything we just mentioned, people who are far smarter than I when it comes to economics believe that poor property rights is the single greatest detriment. Here's our LEQ in review. So we looked at 5 economic characteristics of developing nations. They are low GDP, agriculture-based economy, poor health conditions, an uneducated population, and rapid population rate. And our second LEQ, why have poorly defined property rights been a problem in developing countries? The reason why it's such a problem is because there is no incentive. It's like, if I don't own this land, why should I bother taking care of it? It's not going to make me any money. I'm just going to farm so I can eat and so my kids can eat. Then I'm going to die and they're going to farm so they can eat and their kids can eat. so on and so forth. All right, guys. Thanks for watching the video. You take care.